We're going to move to the first of our two plenary panels this morning, and I'm going to bring up the panelists and introduce our moderator, Rip Rapson, who will then introduce the other panelists. Rip is the president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation. About a year ago, Rip came to LA and talked about Kresge and its work in American cities and sort of the New Economy Initiative. And since then, he's been heavily involved in the Grand Bargain, as it's now called, to bring the city of Detroit out of bankruptcy, along with some other colleagues from the foundation community. I think Rip is sort of one of those role models in foundations and philanthropy who has an idea about how you put together all the assets that philanthropy has to play an important role in a community's civic life. And like I like to say, he's not on the sidelines, he's in there. And so I think he's ideally suited to facilitate this morning's plenary. So Rip, welcome back.
Good morning, everybody. It has been a pleasure to look around the room and see so many people who have been doing this work so effectively for so long. And it puts the panel in a sort of a tricky piece of business here. The conversation that has gone on over the last day has been, from what I've picked up, just extraordinary. I think Elwood was saying that there's been sort of an accelerant quality because the quality of the work that you all do in community is so deep and so profoundly insightful that you sort of cut through all the nonsense and get to the real issues. So in some ways, I think what we want to do with the panel is less sort of synthesize in a traditional sense, but to sort of probe some of the more difficult issues that have been raised over the last couple of days. So that's sort of their first handicap. You have to sort of pile insight on insight, which is never easy. The second is, and this is like the third time I've had to do this, Andrew. I mean, following Andrew is kind of like following the Robert De Niro of philanthropy. I mean, this guy's scary, and I've never heard him say the same thing twice, so you can't quite prepare for what it is he's going to say, for good or for ill. And but it's always actually a privilege to know. I knew Andrew when he was working at Fannie Mae, and he was a star then. But to have someone of this kind of quality and integrity and intelligence in a sector that so desperately needs it is a huge gift. So thank you, Andrew. It's been great to watch you. So you have the biographies of our panel in your packet. I'm not going to go through that, and I think that they are probably folks who are familiar to all of you. From my left to my right, we've got Casey Johnson, who's the executive director of the GreenLight Bay Area and the GreenLight Fund. To her right is Judith Bell, the president of PolicyLink, and to her right is Luke Tate, who's the senior policy advisor with the job title we should all want: Urban Affairs, Justice, and Opportunity at the White House Domestic Policy Council. So it's a real privilege to have you all here. I think my role is really to get out of the way. When you have a panel of this quality, you don't want the rostrum to dominate. So I think what we're going to do is ask each of them to sort of free-form reflect. What are the issues that they want to talk about? Give them as little or as much time as they'd like. And then, if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of get in the mix once each of you has had a little bit of an opportunity to lay out some broad ideas and see if we can't push and prod a little bit. So do we have a sense of preference of who goes first? Do you want to get us started then? Go ahead.
Jump in. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm probably the newbie, I would say, of this group, and I think GreenLight Fund might be relatively new to many of you in this room. Yesterday, somebody in one of the concurrent sessions had asked what the role of venture philanthropy might be with place-based initiatives, and I'm hoping that hearing a little bit of GreenLight Fund's perspective might answer a little bit of that, and particularly the role we play with scale. So GreenLight Fund started in Boston about 10 years ago We're a venture philanthropy firm that is focused on looking at the most critical issues facing children, youth, and their families in our backyards, and identifying the gaps in our communities that the existing social sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector aren't addressing. And then instead of creating a new idea, a new solution, we lift our heads up out of our community and scour the country for the most innovative ideas that have a proven track record. And when we see that they're matching on that critical gap that we've identified in our backyard, we greenlight or import. A lot of folks call us importers. We import them into our community. And we have, about 3 years ago, I launched San Francisco Bay Area for GreenLight, and we also launched GreenLight in Philadelphia, actually much in part to Bank of America, so thank you. They've been a critical partner for us from the beginning. And since then, over the 10 years, we've done 13 imports. We've done 9 into Boston, 2 into Philly, and I've brought 2 into the Bay, and I'm about to select my 3rd. And I would say that the 2 kind of critical pieces that we play as a venture philanthropy firm is really focusing on our community, our place. And in my case, that's the Bay, and loving the Bay and trying to figure out what the most critical issues are in the Bay that we may be able to have some impact on in what we bring in and what we invest. And we do that through a very rigorous selection process. It generally takes us 12 months to find one. And we do that through the type of engagement that once you come into our portfolio, it starts looking very much on how a venture capitalist invests in their companies, except how we invest in our nonprofits. And so the lens that, as I kind of think about place-based initiatives and scale, I would say that the view that we have is really thinking about how we're helping social entrepreneurs grow their footprint and scale their work and their impact throughout the country. But, and this I think is the critical lens that GreenLight has, only when it makes sense for the local community. I think we've oftentimes have seen a really great idea, a really great social entrepreneur, a great idea, a great solution. A funder hears about them, maybe in New Orleans, falls in love with them and says, I'm going to fund them and drop them into Los Angeles. And there is high expectations that will likely fail, and I think we could probably think of 100 reasons of why that would be the case. Instead, we're very much wanting to make sure that whatever we find out there is actually going to fit. It's going to fit with the assets that are already on the ground in the Bay. It's going to fit with the phenomenal work that informally or formally has already taken place with place-based initiatives, and is going to sustain itself. And so things that we weigh and assess, I would say, kind of fall in 4 areas when we're looking at potential organizations to come into our space and have impact. One is what is needed by the community. So looking at data, looking at policy reports, we love PolicyLink, looking at who the players are on the ground. Is there formalized place-based work happening that we could plug into? Where are there gaps in their initiative that we may be able to find something to plug in? Is this actually needed here? And assessing that and talking with people on the ground. The second would be, is it wanted? And that may sound similar to is it needed, but I'm going to make a very, very succinct distinction that it's not. It is different, because I think many people could say, we need this here in San Francisco. We need this here in East Palo Alto. We need this here in Richmond or in Oakland or in Boston or in Philadelphia. But is there the appetite to want this to come in, make it happen so that it's successful and that it's sustainable when our funding and maybe some other early investors' funding ends? And that's where I think there's a lot of problems that face when social entrepreneurs are getting out and scaling their work. It's that they may be needed, but they may not be wanted or be embraced when they're coming into a new community. I think the third thing is definitely, can they have demonstrated impact? And we're obviously assessing what that looks like out in the sites they're already in around the country, and trying to mitigate risk on, can we get that same impact or better impact if we were to bring them in here. but we want to see that they can hit the ground running as quickly as possible, demonstrate impact at the local level in our backyards so that they can attract those that I call the wait and seers. That great that it worked in Chicago, great that it worked in Harlem, but until I see that it's actually working here in my backyard in Oakland, I'm not going to give you a dime. And so GreenLight tends to provide a little bit of that startup capital and runway so that they can make this happen there. And then the fourth, and I think also probably one of the most critical pieces when we're assessing this local fit, is thinking about the long-term sustainability. They will exit with GreenLight. They're not with us forever. Usually after 4 to 5 years, our investment of $800,000 to $1.2 million ends. We take a board seat, so we have a board relationship with them well beyond 6 years at minimum, and they're always in the GreenLight Fund family, but financially they do exit. They are not with us forever, and so we want to make sure that when they're coming in, that need, that want is filled, and that they're able to sustain themselves and position themselves for greater growth. So I would say a lot of people see GreenLight as a decentralized approach and vehicle on bringing solutions to scale. And I think I would agree with that. And I think in that way, we're probably very complementary to place-based initiatives. We're that funder that's lurking to see where are your gaps, where are your holes. Let us help you fill them. So this can be a wonderful continuum of the work that you're doing on the ground. It's not easy. It's not easy work. But the thing that I think holds us as our guiding light is recognizing and celebrating, acknowledging that there are already assets on the ground and strengths on the ground. And that's where I would say there's formal place-based initiative work, but I would argue that almost in any community, there's informal work going on. And to not acknowledge that, to not seek that out and try to understand it, I think would be a deficit. And so that's definitely an approach that we follow. It's understanding who is doing that work on the ground, who's doing it really well, what needs to be done, and then seeking out and finding those that have done it really well in their community, but not just that they've done it really well, how have they done it well in their own backyard? How did it work in Chicago? How did it work in New Orleans? How did it work in Charlotte or St. Louis? What's the secret sauce there? Can that be replicated or contextualized locally when we bring it in? I'll stop there.
Great. Good. Judith.
Great. Well, no surprise, I'm going to talk about policy, being from PolicyLink. But I do want to start with a couple things. You know, I expect many of you know about PolicyLink, but for those who don't, our tagline is lifting up what works. And we believe that local leaders are crafting solutions to some of our nation's greatest challenges, and that that's the way we're going to achieve economic and social equity. So place-based initiatives are essentially the incubators, the places where we're really learning about solutions. And I think at times what we fail to do is to think at the beginning that they're also incubators for policy solutions. And if we think about it at the beginning, then we can actually bake into the place-based initiative the elements that actually will allow us to have that place-based initiative move through a process that will allow it to be a scalable solution that will allow it to turn into policy. And so in order to do that, we really have to think about, okay, so what are the commitments we have to make at the front end if what we're looking to do is to create a solution that can be translated into policy? And so what are some of the things we need to do? We have to collect and track data. And we have to have a commitment to collecting and track data. And then it has to be focused on results. You've got to identify those results, and you have to be vigilant in thinking about those results and being accountable for those results. And then as you begin to see impacts, as you begin to see actually solutions emerging, you have to tease out what the essential ingredients are. We all know you cannot take something that's happened in one community and cookie cutter it into another. And policy, right, is going to spread what you've done from one place to the other. So you have to tease out what the essential ingredients are and then take those essential ingredients and turn them into policy and then tell the story in the process. Okay, but turning it into policy is not the same as doing services, is not the same as doing program. It's a whole other suite of different capacities and of different elements for getting there. So if you're going to do policy, you have to have the capacity to understand the process. You got to know all the rules. You got to know how you get in, how you get out, a gazillion hurdles to go over along the way. You obviously have to know the politics. You've got to know what the political context is. And you've got to know the people. You've got to know both the inside people and the outside people. And you have to know the context. And these are all capacities. These are skills. This is knowledge that very frequently we don't include in place-based initiatives. And it's later down the line when we think we're actually going to then turn it into policy, and we're going to then really go through a scramble to get the right people engaged to be able to move the policy. I want to, rather than just laying out the theory, let me just tell you a couple stories about how we've been able to do it, so you can hear what we've done, and I'll throw in a couple mistakes we've made along the way so that you can know, of course, that none of this is perfect, and even when you plan and even when you start baking it in, you're going to have all sorts of different obstacles to get around. So one thing that has been actually for us a wonderful experience is the experience of having been involved with the Harlem Children's Zone right after the president, then a candidate, started talking about taking the Harlem Children's Zone and turning it into promised neighborhoods. Now, actually, the Harlem Children's Zone did not start with an intention around policy. So it wasn't like they had baked into their model what it would mean to take their success and turn it into policy. Jeff Canada was on our board. He'd been on our board since we started. And so he turned to PolicyLink and said, please partner with us. What are we going to do if this guy actually gets elected, right? What are we going to do? How are we going to be ready? And so we began a very bit of a fast sprint, but we had some time to really explore what would it mean to take this place-based model and turn it into policy. And so what did we do? We began by thinking about, okay, what were the principles that the Harlem Children's Zone was based on? Serving an entire neighborhood comprehensively, creating a pipeline of programs, right? Cradle to career, thinking about what does it take from the moment a child is born, going through the baby college, moving through preschool, school, neighborhood, housing, et cetera. And then they actually had gone through a whole process of thinking about a kid gets in college. They've gone from Harlem to college, like what kind of supports do they need to actually make it through there? Thinking about community, residents, institutions, right, stakeholders, really about community building. And then creating a data feedback loop that was about evaluating their programs along the way and making changes to make sure that every child was served. And it was that data, frankly, that became so critical to actually allowing the Harlem Children's Zone to show its success, that inspired the president, that allowed it then to be turned into a program. And then finally, cultivating a culture of success. So we came up with these 5, and we thought, okay, so how do you take those 5 and turn it into policy? And frankly, we came up with a whole policy framework. We spoke to people around the country. We talked to rural communities, suburban communities, trying to figure out, you're not going to take something from Harlem and its dense reality and just pick it up and plop it into all these other communities around the country. What would you need? But there was really something that came to us a little bit later on that has been critical to success. And that was to say, how will we know that we're succeeding? And so we went through actually a very in-depth process of figuring out what results were we seeking and what indicators would help us know and help places know that they were getting to success. And so we created, with our partners at the Harlem Children's Zone, with the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and with researchers, a results framework. And that results framework, with 10 results and 15 indicators, has been driving the work through the Promised Neighborhoods program at the Department of Education, but also drives work on the ground in communities around the country that recognize that this is a model that can work with them, because as they look at those results and they look at those indicators, then they think about their own reality. They think about their own communities, their own leadership, their own schools, their own housing situations, et cetera, and they craft the strategies that will allow them to look at those indicators and get to those results. And it's that flexibility that is built into both the policy and its implementation. So This focus on results then has been critical in the implementation process because it has pushed a culture of accountability and it's pushed a discipline and a rigor at the front end of what's happening at site. So what are they going to do about data systems? And then getting almost all the sites to be on a data system so that when they sit down together in a community of practice, they're not ending up comparing, well, your data system works this way and mine works that way. And they're actually on a shared platform so that the conversation starts at a higher level. And then it allows each of those, both leaders and each of those efforts, to have a deeper way of sharing and a deeper way of learning together. So that's really been critical along the way. And then it has been really recognizing that leadership and bringing that leadership into the policy arena. So the program starts, and just because the program is starting and just because it's now begun doesn't mean that the policy stops. Because one, you're learning from what's happening, and so that's going to require additional policy change. And then two, if you want the program to continue, you have to convince policymakers that it's worthwhile. And if it's successful, you have to convince them to put more resources in and to expand the arenas in which it can happen. And that requires advocacy. And too often, really I would say in the philanthropic community and beyond, there's this fear of advocacy. And there's this belief that if the good information is out there, if the data is out there, the analysis is out there, the research is out there, that policymakers will pick it up and things will happen. And yeah, every once in a while you can come up with a story about that. But by and large, the way it really starts to happen is when the people who are doing the work actually have the resources to come and talk to policymakers, when you have the data and when you have the ability to do real advocacy that at times will have to include lobbying. You just have to be able to make the argument that this action, this piece of legislation, this budget really has to look this way to get to the outcome that you're seeking. And I can't tell you how many times, we'll go to Capitol Hill and we'll go with local leaders. And when you go, state houses, city council, I don't care where you are, when you are with a constituent, the relationship, the conversation is completely different. There's a level of respect, and there is a level of, I can learn something from you because you are in the community, you're working, and then there is a conversation that is less about politics and more about substance, and therefore a greater chance of actually getting to policy impact. So we really have to, if we want to get to these large-scale impacts, if we really want to be able to talk about sustainable change, we want to get to that population level where we're really making a difference. We're really allowing children, families, residents of low-income communities, of communities of color to really reach their full potential, then we've got to plan for success. And planning for success means planning for all these different elements and also planning for policy change. And so baking in these critical ingredients so that when we get to start to see that success bubbling up, we can scale it, we can translate it, and we can continue that process of bringing change to the places that need it the most.
It's terrific. Thank you. Luke.
So I think I'm going to stay on this topic of scaling, particularly from a federal perspective. And when we're talking about what it takes to take some of the successful efforts that we've seen PolicyLink involved in across the country to national scale, I think everybody in the room knows the answer. It's very simple. It's money. It's large investments that can make possible local leadership adopting a lot of the practices and the models that you've seen across the country. And we're starting from a baseline. I think, as everybody knows, one of the main vectors of investment that we have to drive place-based initiatives is housing. It's housing spending. And we're starting from a baseline of investment to subsidize home ownership through the mortgage interest deduction that far outstrips anything that we're doing to invest in rental housing or housing for low-income Americans who are having a hard time affording it. So, the bottom line, and we will continue to drive at this, is that we need to get to a better balance on that spending. But even within the money that we devote to advancing the sort of outcomes that we're seeking in low-income communities, we need to do a much better job of targeting that funding to what works. And we have examples out there like Promise Neighborhoods, which Judith was just talking about, like Choice Neighborhoods, at HUD, which are delivering extraordinary results. Our now current HUD secretary, when he was back in San Antonio, helped lead the effort to knit those two different programmatic tools together in the east side of San Antonio. Inside of 4 years, Sam Houston High School, which is right there in that neighborhood, went from having a 46% graduation rate to a 90% graduation rate. That's ridiculous. That's incredible. We don't get those results just about anywhere. So we have these tools that we know work. They're working incredibly well. And yet, and we ought to be funding them at hundreds of millions of dollars per year. And that's what the administration's been asking for. The reality, as Judith was just discussing, is that we have not seen the support on the Hill for making those investments. And we still see more support for the sort of legacy programs like the Community Services Block Grant, for which it's really difficult to see any evidence that it's actually leading to results and outcomes that we care about, and similar programs. So, that's the first thing, is we have to agree that what we care about is results. And that the results that just about everybody cares the most about are pretty straightforward. It's jobs, education, and safety. Yesterday, Bart Harvey was talking about the challenge of investing in affordable housing in a community, and the community saying, well, what we really want is jobs. But that's okay, because they were making the right investments, because we understand, even though it's difficult to get this argument across sometimes, that jobs and educational outcomes are often second and third order outcomes. They're the results of improving the opportunities in a community, reducing the stressors in a community, bringing down violent crime within a community. And so we have to agree that we care about those results and tie everything that we are doing, whether it's on the housing side or the health side, to those sort of longer-term outcomes, and be comfortable evaluating the success of our investments against those. Which brings me to, I think, the second thing that the federal government can do to help scale the sort of evidence-based, place-based initiatives that we're here to talk about. And that's increasing the level of rigor that we use in making federal investments in local efforts. I think you'll see this approach embodied in our Promise Zones application, where we are moving beyond looking at the specific programmatic models like Choice Neighborhoods and Promise Neighborhoods that have worked, I think, fairly well, and looking instead to just the bones of the effort locally. Do you have a cross-sector partnership with high-capacity leaders on those teams? Are they agreed upon? Have they agreed upon shared goals? Right? Are they investing their own proprietary resources in the approaches that have the strongest evidence for achieving those goals, and that are responsive to the needs and assets of that community? Are they relentlessly tracking their data and sharing it transparently across partners and publicly, so that they can use it for continuous improvement? Right? Some folks call that collective impact. Some folks just call it good management. But that's what we need to be. That's what we need to be working on. And so it's, for the next 2 years, I think it's a job of building those principles, the principles of the Promise Zones effort, into every single thing that the federal government is doing, every investment we're making. We've proposed at various points a reform to the Community Development Block Grant that would include a catalytic fund that would incentivize these types of investments. I think we're going to continue to look at stuff like that. We're going to continue to look at how we can get our Title I dollars, how we can get our CSBG, our SSBG, our CDBG dollars, all driving toward our public housing investment dollars. We had this conversation yesterday, all driving toward the outcomes and results that we care most about, and having those results and outcomes at the center of what that money is going toward, as opposed to the sort of programmatic activities that have oftentimes been funded with little attention to what sort of outcomes are being achieved. So that's where I think we can do the most to help scale.
Well, say a word more about that, would you? I mean, because I've talked to a number of people who have said, what happens with the next administration change? I mean, do we just sort of fall off the cliff? I mean, how effectively, I don't know if you're able to be candid about this, but how effectively do you believe the government has in fact baked this in? How deep does it go? How pervasive is it in sort of the community updraft? Or are we going to start all over and reinvent in 2 years?
Look, so I guess there's two answers to this question. The first thing is that it's not about the federal government, right? The federal government didn't come up with Promise Neighborhoods or Choice Neighborhoods or Promise Zones either. Each of those initiatives was our attempt the administration's attempt to do our very best job at building into the federal apparatus what had actually been innovated and created on the ground. And the demand for those types of approaches was coming from the innovations that had happened in an 8-year period where the federal government was not a very good partner in that activity. And so, I think going forward, you're going to continue to hear from community after community across the country that have spent such time building these cross-sector partnerships, agreeing upon shared goals, choosing strategies. They're not going to accept a federal partner that is not asking that of them. I think the second thing, which is something that is very much on our mind for the next 2 years, is that this is something that has gone fairly deep into the federal bureaucracy and the career leadership. You've got extraordinary career leadership at HUD and at Education and DOJ that over the course of the last 6 years, and so on and so forth, the different federal agencies over the course of the last 6 years have begun working together as this sort of standard operation of their jobs. This is not something that was happening before, but it is something now where the team that is running our public housing investments is meeting on an every month basis with the team at Education and the team at HHS that are working to make sure that their investments are flowing both programmatically and geographically in a way that's well aligned. And so, irrespective of this administration heading out the door, I think you've seen the development of just a way of doing business at the federal level that has eliminated, or not eliminated, but certainly improved the partnership across these different domains, policy domains, from housing and education and health. And in each and every one of those partnerships, what folks are meeting about are outcomes and results. They're not meeting about, are program audits going well? They're meeting about, are we achieving the outcomes and the results that we've agreed upon prioritizing with this funding?
Yeah, on this point, I think what Luke is saying is absolutely true, that where you never would have seen relationships, they exist, and that matters. And I think we are seeing some of the innovations that have come out of the place-based initiatives translating into policy, like through the regulatory apparatus. So just one example, over at HUD in the Sustainable Communities Initiative, they had a fair housing equity assessment, right? It was part of the initiative, but now they've taken what they learned in that process, and there's a rule to affirmatively further fair housing, and that rule will be in the regulatory arena, right? So it will have the power of law, and it will spread across the country and improve fair housing for every community. So they really took what they were learning and they've translated in a way now that will become baked in. And we've seen it in other places. There is a consciousness to really try and think through how can we get it baked in and how can it be really embraced by career bureaucrats in a way that will keep it moving regardless of what happens with the next administration.
So Judith, what's the rub? You've got the bake-in at the federal level.
Right.
You've got an increasing uptake at the local level for data and results and advocacy. Mission accomplished.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, and I have no illusions. Spent enough time doing this work. I think the other thing is that you have opportunities at the local and state level, right? So we've taken, for instance, Promised Neighborhoods, and we have not seen the expansion of the funding like Luke was talking about.
Right.
So we've created, and Dixon has worked on this in California, to take a model and try and move state legislation so that you could potentially have a Promised Neighborhoods program at the state level. So we have not solved it. We have a long, long way to go, but we have taken some important steps, and there are lots of things that also can be done at the local and the state level that we need to innovate that way as well. Not everything is also ready to be scaled to the federal level. Not everything should be.
Just to build quickly on Judith's point around Promised Neighborhoods at the state level, I don't want to get ahead of some announcements that folks are planning to make, but the promise, but I'm going to do it anyway. The promise zone model isn't and shouldn't be ours, right? It actually, if you think about the way that the set of incentives works for promise zones, one could imagine that it would work a lot better at the state level, where the governor has stronger control over, and the state legislature has stronger control over targeting health, public safety, and education funding. And I think it's very possible that folks will very soon be. I'm speculating.
Go ahead and tweet this. It's fine. Yeah.
We'll be looking to find governors who want to say, look, we appreciate what the president is doing. We think that's great. We think we need to do more. We're going to do it here in our states and have their own promise zones. And we think good for them if that were to happen.
At some point in the near future.
Never happened. Yeah. Casey.
The one thing I wanted to add, because it hasn't been mentioned yet, but I think the federal government kind of taking a lead with the Social Innovation Fund, I think has been another really great place to see scaling what works and trying to help social entrepreneurs get their proven innovations out there and move the needle on their level of rigor with their evidence base. But from our perspective, since most of GreenLight Fund's investors are very much in the private sector, are generally venture capitalists, hedge fund, angel, entrepreneur, tech entrepreneurs, and we're in the Social Innovation Fund as an intermediary, it's been really great to talk with our investors who would like to see the federal government get better about moving the needle on investing in what works, and to actually see a vehicle that's taking place to do that and that's engaging the private sector community around that. And that also, in case you're going to ask a follow-up question, Rep, has not proven itself out yet. We're, I think, 5 years in, and only four cohorts in of funders who make up that, probably almost 30 funders around the country who make up that intermediary group with almost 300 subgrantees right now. So data is starting to come out and starting to show some proof points and starting to show engagement from the private sector around this, but we're hopeful.
Maybe I could ask slightly differently. I mean, does the scenario that Judith describes seem to you like an alien universe? Is this what you see when you move into a community, that these kinds of capacities are increasingly present and being utilized and exploited?
It is a little alien to some extent.
Yeah, I kind of figured.
Yeah, to some extent it is. It probably depends on the stakeholders. As I think we would all imagine, it depends on the stakeholders and their appetite for this. I think it is moving in a positive direction, at least across the three communities that we're in Boston and Philly and the Bay Area. If we were to go into the South or the Midwest, which we have intentions of doing in the next couple of years, I think we may find it much harder.
So just to build on that point a little bit, another thing that the federal government could do to really enhance the odds of taking these sorts of initiatives to scale, one part is certainly building these principles into the rest of our programs. The other thing we need to do a much better job of is investing in building the backbone capacity of local organizations that drive this work, and in particular, building out their data infrastructure. And this is something that we've seen as a focus of the efforts in Detroit, as you're more aware of. But here in Los Angeles, you got a promise zone where they already had that sort of capacity in place. They're doing an extraordinary job with their data. They're doing the same thing in Philadelphia. That's rare across the country. And so, while we continue to invest millions and millions of dollars in technical assistance through traditional models and HUD Section 4 and others, we need to do a much better job, I think, of augmenting that investment with investing in building the capacity of the local backbone organizations and the data architecture necessary to actually share seamlessly across the partners who are driving these efforts.
So I never thought I would ask a question like this, but so if the federal government really has its act together, and with all due respect,
we're getting there.
Yeah, you're getting there. And the state government is a work in progress. I mean, pardon me from sort of extrapolating from my experience in Detroit, but local government can be a problem, right? Mm-hmm. And so where is the policy work? Where is where is that whole critical path of work as you sort of hit sort of areas that may not have the capacity of a Bay Area or of a Boston or of some of the other places you might work at? It just strikes me that the policy context is often reinforced, distorted, disassembled at the local level. And so how do you come at it?
Well, there's an upside to places with capacity, and there's also even an upside for places that are smaller that don't have as much capacity. Because you go to a place like New York or San Francisco or Chicago, and there's quite an infrastructure, and you got to navigate that infrastructure, and you got to line up a lot of people to get something done. You go to a place with less capacity, and if you get just a few people enthusiastic and invested in something that they want to see done, and you can bring in some resources and some capacity for innovation, and you can actually get things rolling. I think it is why when you look across some of the grantees for programs, or when you think about like what's bubbling up where, when you go to a place that's not one of these big places, what you see is a handful of very dedicated people who have built a very solid relationship, who have some principles and some values, and have garnered enough resources, support, and built some infrastructure to start to get things rolling, and then they're building off of the assets that are there that the residents have. I mean, you've seen it in Detroit as well, right? What's happening in Detroit and what's been happening over time is that same kind of story of finding the community leadership that is indigenous that's there and figuring out the successful supports that actually build it up and spread it in a way that the place begins to turn, and where people have more hope, and then they become more invested. And the policy just has to be a way of fueling that, right? Because it creates the supports and the structures along the way. The other thing, of course, is you do have these big resources flowing in through all the different programs, and those actually can be building blocks as well. The silos can create some challenges, but they can be building blocks that really provide a platform to make other changes.
And I think the funder, as I said, I think it's an interesting role for funders to potentially play on the ground, whether it's in larger communities or smaller communities. That and thinking about the Bay Area, particularly thinking about the community foundation's role, we've got, as you know, we've got some big ones in the Bay with large assets, and I think seeing what role they can play in providing the space to identify and then bring these community leaders together and then move the needle. Because although there are some great things happening on the ground locally at the policy level, it is extremely complicated to navigate at the same time in these communities. And it takes time, and it takes relationship building, and it also takes it takes kind of credibility as well. And I think community foundations in particular, but other funders that play a large role in their communities could step into that and use some political will.
Well, I mean, if we can stay on that and the sort of the funding ecology for a moment. I mean, it's really interesting to think about the venture world approaching this the way they have through GreenLight. I mean, it's particularly thoughtful and modulated. National philanthropy is not always quite so subtle and skilled. What in this mix of things should philanthropy do? Large national philanthropy or local philanthropy, either private family foundations or embedded foundations or community foundations? I mean, what are the 2 or 3 things they ought to be doing to move this needle in a different direction?
So I wouldn't be too hard on the big national foundations.
Oh, good, thanks.
And I think, in particular, they've brought on a lot of really sharp folks in the last 2, 3, 4 years that I think is really going to help a few of them. But not to jump to the next panel. But,
I was going to say.
Look, the federal government through promise zones and these sort of other efforts, in particular through promise zones, is trying to take on, and we need to do a better job of it, we're getting there, but we're trying to take on a more appropriate level of humility about what our role is, right? Once we have had that sort of high bar, that higher level of rigor for the bones of the effort, making sure that we are in the job of partnering and facilitating and eliminating roadblocks and providing resources necessary to carry out the work. That doesn't work that well when the capacity is not there on the ground. So I think the role of large foundations in these cases is oftentimes not necessarily engaging with or even directly taking on local governments with difficult politics, but rather building the strength of the institutions that will become locally the force for either getting the mayor out of the way, or even if it's a mayor without capacity, just getting them on board, but without them actually being the one that's driving the work.
Yeah, let me pick up just a thread and then turn it over to you. I mean, in some ways, it's interesting to think about the dichotomy between large national foundations who often don't have these sort of local connections and the smaller community-based foundations who really end up becoming sort of the Sherpas for large. I think, Zav, of Ford. I mean, Ford has this extraordinary, infrastructure of talent and wisdom and history, and yet they don't hit the ground without really needing some ground truth and intelligence. And I think one of the hazards of these kinds of conversations is that Ford, Kresge, big national foundations are fine, but the real critical mass exists at the community level, often with a different skill set, a different set of historical ties to the place. And I have the sense that has traditionally been an underutilized resource and increasingly can be a much more important player in these conversations.
Yeah, I think it is about that partnership, right? I mean,
Yeah.
It has to be both about that partnership and about that respect. It has to be something that's organically created and not something that the National Foundation just wants to see. And then it has to be about the local leadership really driving that change, and about that local leadership also being inclusive leadership, right? That's got a way of integrating real community voice into it. Mm-hmm. And then you've got something that really a partnership with investment from national foundations can really accelerate things and build a lot of momentum and possibility.
Can you all say just a word about sort of the issue of rural communities? Elwood was saying over breakfast that one of the interesting insights that he heard come up yesterday in one of the panels was a little bit, I think, what the both of you were saying earlier, is that sometimes when there isn't a deeply built out nonprofit infrastructure, when there's not the presence of big and small local foundations, the dynamic of the build is different. And people end up falling on sort of more intrinsic, sort of organic community assets in a way that sometimes may not be as necessary, where you've sort of got the crutch of big money or big institutional presence. I mean, how does this equation, I was thinking, Casey, when you were describing how you're working, does that move into rural settings, or is that fundamentally?
That's a big question for us right now. I don't have the answer, because GreenLight has very much been grappling with it. I'm from Farmville, Virginia, which I'm guessing nobody in this room has ever heard of that, or if you have, it's through Zynga. And there's Farmville is a game, and it's no relation to my hometown. I wish there was a kickback to Farmville. But I'm from a very rural town. That's where my roots are. It's where my family still is to this day. And I've been pushing GreenLight, and for us to think about what it would mean to have an adapted GreenLight model for rural communities. And we're not there yet. We're still figuring out how to scale ourselves when we scale nonprofits. So we're still trying to figure out our model and see how it works, even to some extent outside of communities that have a large VC and entrepreneur base that are very attractive as investors to our work. Philadelphia is a little experiment in that. I've joked with my colleague there that I've got probably 500 VCs that we've been talking to in the Bay Area, and he has 5 in Philadelphia. And so they're experimenting a little bit with how you can leverage folks who are relatively new to philanthropy and who are intrigued by GreenLight's kind of vehicle and function to get them in and leverage those dollars in a sustainable way over the long haul. But we haven't quite gotten there yet. I will say yet, because if I have anything to say about it, we will get there, and we will do some experimenting in rural communities, but we're not there yet.
It's different.
Sure.
It's different, and I think it's really important to start with that statement that it's different, and the pace is different, right? The pace of change is different. And I think there really has been an investment into rural communities to say we're not going to just ignore rural communities. So there are promised neighborhood sites in rural communities, right? You can go through all these different examples, and what we're seeing in those places is how change looks different but can happen. And some of the dynamics, though, are similar. The dynamics around race can be quite similar in rural communities as urban communities, and the challenge of moving institutions and institutional change, systems change, is similar as well. But how you get from here to there, I mean, like just issues, for instance, of transportation, like getting people around a table is a completely different challenge in a rural community than it is in an urban community. And so I think the ability to bring in rural and then innovate off of some of these models and recognize that it will be different, and then to figure out what we're really learning that can suggest new pathways. I do think some of the new partnerships at the federal level that Luke can speak to really are designed to say, okay, so we know these are entrenched serious problems of poverty and inequity, and what are we going to do to allow rural communities to also figure it out? But it's definitely a story under development and success yet to really take hold in big ways.
Well, and also, I may be wrong, but it just seems to me that philanthropy in particular has tended to sort of fence off rural philanthropy in lots of different ways. And one of the things that I've observed coming out of Minnesota, where we have, I think, some of the most innovative rural planning, development, philanthropy in the country, is the extent to which those communities really have a lot to teach urban communities. It's always sort of assumed that it's the flip, and there may be something to that. But I think that the tendency to push them to one side and assume that some kind of wall drops is a big mistake.
I think the other thing is that there's huge advantage to figuring out the relationship, right, between rural and urban, because in most of our states, and for that matter in the country, we've got to have that, otherwise forget getting the policy change. I mean, you can't walk into the US Senate and not be able to talk about rural as well as urban, and that's true across the country. I was just at a meeting recently with the leader of the Appalachian Community Foundation, and she got in a conversation with folks from urban Kentucky working in the African American community, recognizing that actually some of their challenges were similar, their strategies might be different, but that there were ways they can start thinking about policy that could get them both to policy change at the state level that otherwise they couldn't think about. So there's that as well, and that is a place where foundations could help to make some connections that could help with some bigger changes and help with some learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think Judith's right. There's no question we're further behind in terms of our learning on the rural side. I do think, however, that we're seeing a lot, the pace of progress of that learning is a lot faster right now in rural and tribal areas. Part of the reason that we ensured that we had rural and tribal and will continue in future iterations of it, in future designations to ensure that we have rural and tribal chromosomes was not just to make sure that we had good representation across places, which is important, but also to use that as a mechanism to force the federal government to teach itself how to do a better job of doing that work in rural and tribal areas. And so, to the extent that we have had some measure of success in really driving home that message with the agencies about the need to take on this more appropriate level of humility and that their role is in partnering and facilitating. We have seen, in Kentucky, sort of rapid success from the SOAR effort. It's a bipartisan team out there doing a great job. We've had a much harder time in the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And that has forced HUD and HHS and education and all of the chunks of those agencies that weren't Indian Health Services and that weren't the sort of component of the agency solely devoted to interacting with Native American communities, and has forced the broader agencies to learn how to be better partners to those communities. And we're already seeing the impacts of that in all the other parts of Indian country where those departments are working, not just in the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma that has forced them to learn how to do a better job of that work. So we're definitely not there yet, but I think it's a good direction right now.
And I think if I'm thinking about from a social entrepreneur perspective, there's so much more incentive for them to go to large urban environments to do their work. It's where the money is. It's where a lot of the pull is, and we love the pull effect. But I don't see too many incentives and push around getting those great innovations when they could work if adapted into rural communities. I don't see that happening necessarily from a variety of funding perspectives that maybe we as funders could play a role in, a more significant role in.
I think one other thing on the rural side is that from an economic perspective, I would say one place where there is a lot of innovation is around food.
Yeah,
and
Memphis.
thinking about regional economies
Yep.
and making that linkage between rural and urban. That could be quite powerful, and where there's some exciting innovation happening, really exciting stuff, for instance, happening out of Maine, which is helping to build that economy and making linkages down into the Boston area, et cetera. So food actually is one place where economically is driving some development, some growth, and some innovation.
It's happening right now in Memphis, the Memphis area as well, where you've got multiple federal agencies and multiple local governments, county and city, that are working to develop the Memphis food shed, and they're looking at it again from a regional economic perspective,
Right.
building the strength of that regional economy as opposed to anything around nutrition, although that's
That'll
in large
happen
part where the impact is.
Really great panel, thank you. Hey, Luke. I have a question actually for Luke. Silo busting has been a kind of running theme of the convening thus far, and you already touched on it. Clearly, this administration has pushed this in unprecedented ways. Can you drill down a little bit, though, for us? What's been learned about when it works? What does it take to make it work well?
Yep.
And I guess where it's not working, where you'd like to see it pushed even further, what can those outside government do to nudge it along?
So, thanks, Mark. I think it's a great area to focus on. The Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative was sort of built at the White House for this purpose. Practically, what it has meant is getting the different departments to agree upon shared metrics. So, can't have the Department of Education and HHS both funding pre-K programs and having a different way of measuring whether or not a kid is ready for kindergarten, which is what we came into. Yeah, but I think what we've seen, like where it actually works and what happens when it works, is you've got to have an opportunity for the agencies to work as partners in a particular place to learn then how to partner better in general. So the example here, I think, is actually San Antonio, where they had a Promised Neighborhoods grant, they had a Choice Neighborhoods grant, and the sort of theory of the case was like, okay, good. Now, because it's all designed to mesh, it will mesh, because all of the design really was sort of like perfectly integrated. And then it hit the ground and like nothing meshed, because you had two different grantees, two different fiscal agents, and you had the sort of the failure of there had not yet been the work necessary to develop the local partnerships to reflect the sort of idea that these policies were going to be working hand in hand. And so it actually took DOJ, HUD, and education officials traveling out to San Antonio for a couple days of meetings to figure out how they could design their sort of grant management operations in such a way that it would incentivize and nudge toward that sort of operational partnership at the local level, which then resulted in Mayor Castro beginning to hold monthly meetings, bringing together the school officials and the housing officials and everything else. And so, I think where it has worked is where the federal government has gone out across all different components and said, how can we be more responsive partners to you? Which I think we've seen a little bit in Detroit. We've seen a little bit, in the recovery from Hurricane Sandy, and then has built those lessons back in. I think where it hasn't worked is where we have been looking for more flexibility to do that, and have run into congressional committees that say, look, you are a housing agency, you're going to do housing activities, and that's what we're going to fund you to do. And so until there is more demand, I think, from the ground to make clear the utility of HUD, education, HHS, DOL, DOJ, collaborating to be better partners to local leaders, we will continue to get funding imperatives and guidance from congressional committees that make that work more difficult.
Hi, I'm Raphael Bostic. I just wanted to piggyback on Luke because it could be a bit more specific in terms of what that collaboration required. So for the Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative, the White House convened everyone, but each agency had to identify a single person who was responsible and who had the responsibility to advocate for the idea in their department. And so Luke was that for HUD, and he wound up going to all the agencies, all the parts of the agency, getting the attorneys to rewrite the programs with the right language, going through all the approvals, and the accountability was clear. And then we brought that back, and And that happened in all the agencies before it could be coherent. And so while the idea in getting the leadership to do it is important, it's also important to really assign accountability, have clear lines of responsibility and authority, and also recognize that you've got to do a whole advocacy work in each of the agencies and get them all on board.
Can I just say on that point, that's also starting to be translated at the state level and even at the local level. And I think it's really important to listen to the intricacies of what it takes and to what the results are. Because what we've seen in different places is it's really, as Luke was saying, it's like government taking on the notion of collective impact. And it starts, yes, at that leadership level, but then you have to have staff who believe in it and who are going to make it their business to actually both develop the relationship and then figure out what the initiatives are. And then in some places, there's actually then resources for those folks to start massaging through their new efforts. And it really starts to look different. It starts to look different in terms of the policies and the impacts, and it starts to look different in terms of the engagement of community. So it is, this is this feedback loop, right? This is a national model that we can start translating to the state and the local level, because we have to have that integrated approach wherever we are, because the silos aren't just federal silos. The silos translate all the way down. So thinking about like what the infrastructure should look like, how public it should be, how less public it maybe should be, and then what it looks like, and what kind of programs and new policies and new resources you might want to push through it, I think can really make a difference. Here in California, there's a Strategic Growth Council that's pulling together leadership, and we're seeing it in other places as well.
Yeah, I mean, the local silos are a huge barrier, and I think that's why it's so exciting. I don't know if John's still here, John Barrows, but Boston is a city with historically incredibly difficult silos.
Concrete.
And it was like, an overwhelming joy to me when I heard that John got that job. It's like someone's getting over there who understands this. So, and you see that city by city.
I'm a little bit loath to do this, but Zav, you spent a couple of weeks in federal government. Is there,
2 different times, right?
does that, anything you want to add into this mix?
Thanks, Rip, and thanks to everyone on the panel. This is probably obvious, but it's both important, as Luke and others have said, to authorize this kind of commitment. John Barrows and the mayor of Boston do it at one level, the White House at another, and then there's a Sacramento version, right, and Albany, New York, and go on down the list. It's really important, I think, to be able to make the case that, I'll put it slightly different than we've talked about so far, place-based approaches are important to accomplishing national goals or state-level goals or local-level, City of Los Angeles. Again, you can fill in the blank at any level, but you sort of say whether our priorities are improving wellness while bringing down healthcare costs, rising to the challenges of the climate crisis and resilience, or things at that level that are clear priorities. To be able to make a case, and we certainly tried in the president's first term to lay out a framework and to sort of create it as a North Star and a direction. It's also enormously important then to recognize that you got to do what Luke and Judith and Raphael were just talking about, and that is go into what some people call the boiler room of government. Yeah. It's not the sexy part. It's not the stuff of stirring speeches. It's government attorneys and it's grants officers, and it's them engaged with people outside the agency to really talk through the nitty-gritty, the stuff that completely undermines you and takes the wind out the sails if you don't solve for it. And that also begs a question, it seems to me, about the next generation of public service in this country. Yep. It needs to be noted, and I'll single out HUD because it's one of the critical agencies, and it's as good a case on this as any. Roughly half of HUD could retire tomorrow. HUD does not have a bench yet. It needs young talent. It needs young people, millennials and those who follow millennials, to aspire to leading and problem solving from inside of government, and to see that as noble and important. And that, in addition to resident leadership and the other things that I know have been a part of this important convening, is a critical piece of the picture.
Alex Morales with the Magnolia Community Initiative here in Los Angeles. My observation, and maybe I'm too pessimistic, is that in the next generation, I do not see substantial increasing of financial resources from government at any level, federal, state, or local. I do not see the philanthropic community substantially increasing. I don't see the corporate community, they're still trying to get back to level of giving that they were pre-recession. I feel that the holy grail is, can you create savings within areas that government is already investing in, such as health and education and housing, and fund the translation of those savings to fund the infrastructures that will produce that? Do you think that's as crazy as the other ideas and we won't get there? But when we talk about, well, what should philanthropy investing in corporations, they should be investing in how do we produce the savings and the policies that will let us recollect that from government. But I'm curious if you think that's doable or not.
I mean, I'll just jump right in. I think I'm more optimistic, but I'll cede that to you. But I do think that there's experimentation going on and pay for success at the government. And again, it's right now, I think it's sitting within a couple agencies, but definitely in the Social Innovation Fund that's trying to get at that. We're trying to learn from our colleagues in England and see how that can be adapted. There's been a couple of tests and trials in New York with Rikers Island. Boston, Massachusetts, I think is further along with ROCA, and California, we're trying to keep up and catch up. And there's feasibility studies that will be done as a part of the Pay for Success under the Social Innovation Fund to test out, I think, the appetite for this, but also to test out from the organizations, the nonprofit organizations, are they ready? Can they be ready? Can they do this work? And the investor community to see if they actually want to invest in this and take some risk in it. My take on it is that we at GreenLight and me personally, we're excited to see where this can go, but it's still too early to call if it's worked or will work.
I'd just say one thing, which is that we have to perfect this issue of, so if I have a savings over here,
Yeah.
right? Everyone's nodding their heads because they know what I'm going to say. I have a savings over here. It gets held over here, even though it really should be spread. So this whole way that because we're working in silos, savings don't actually translate. And so then so I give you an example. I create healthier housing. So people are healthier. So there's a savings in the health system. The folks in housing never see that. So their incentives are really because they believe that it is the right thing to do, but really we should have a mechanism that says, I provide housing for previously chronically homeless people. I'm going to save, there's a ton of data. I'm going to save a huge amount of money for the health system. We need a way to bring that back in so we can create more housing, right? So we can solve the homelessness problem, but we really haven't figured that out yet. It's a major challenge.
Is that susceptible of being cracked?
Say it again?
Do you think that there is a possibility that we will get there, or is this just so inherently difficult that this is nice to talk about, but not much more?
No, I think to me, I guess it's like it's so overwhelmingly logical that at some point, someplace, I think it's going to be like another one of these local innovations that's somehow going to figure it out, because it's just ridiculous, isn't it? Right? I mean, we really do know that this is a classic. Right? If you put people in housing, they will be healthier. And we actually know how to keep people there, right? We know about the supports, and we know we can document it. We got all the data. So and it's compelling case. You can sit down with business people, and you can make the compelling case, and they believe the compelling case. And so because I think you can share it widely in terms of political perspective, maybe I'm just an optimist. I think we'll figure it out.
It's solvable because we have to solve it, right? Like, veteran homelessness is down, 33% in the last 4 years. Unsheltered veteran homelessness down 43%. And that's happening because people believe the case that you're making, so they're willing to invest in it. But we've got to get to the point where, OMB and even CBO can score the savings on Medicaid and Medicare that we realized by investing in coordinating housing with supportive services to delay or prevent nursing home institutionalization. And that improves quality of life too. That's not happening in the next couple months. We need to get there over the next many years. But I'm more optimistic. I think people are not, the long run political trend is that there will be less and less will for investing in social programs that we can't prove work, right? And I think that last part is, if we keep this results and outcome focus, I think we'll continue to see the willingness to invest in the way that we have seen in chronic and veteran homelessness over the past few years.
Can I just ask what is sort of inside baseball, I suppose, to everybody in the room, is that, and maybe to Sav as well, is Sean Donovan at OMB a harbinger of hope that we can actually crack some of this code? I mean, when I talked to Secretary Donovan when he was leaving HUD and went over to OMB, I said, why are you doing this? I mean, I get that the president asked you, but say no. He gave me a very interesting answer. He said, because OMB for too long has been the organization that said no. It has not been sufficiently the organization that said yes at the front. And I don't mean to disrespect anyone who is at OMB, but you sort of have the sense of a system designer in Sean and the possibility of sort of breaking some of this code, or is 2 years just too short a time to make real progress?
I can't speak for Sean as to specific things and the timelines by which he would be trying to achieve them. I think he has been very clear about how he thinks about these problems and about how collectively, OMB and the White House and the Hill can work to solve them. And I think we're very lucky to have someone in that position who understands them and thinks about them that way.
I was thinking as Elwood was reminding us about yesterday, and this is about moving forward, we sort of have been talking really about breaking down silos and leveraging, but we left out what Andrew said about the business community seems to have an appetite to help, and it seems like maybe a perfect storm, but I didn't hear us talk about how to leverage that. So I don't know if that's a smart enough question to end this.
It absolutely
but I was
is.
curious about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some small ways through our lens, we're absolutely trying to leverage it, and maybe a particular kind of the business community for GreenLight that we're leveraging. And again, our folks are in the private sector, are usually coming into philanthropy for the first time and getting oriented to it, and have a fairly negative view of the nonprofit sector and the role of government. And so we're trying to change that, one investor at a time, but in 3 communities right now. But I'm also really hopeful about what the Social Innovation Fund is doing, because the mandate is that the private sector community has to step in and match any dollar that the federal government will give. And so you see funders and subgrantees, I hate that word, but the subgrantees of ours who are going out and who are talking about this to the private sector community that oftentimes they have not talked to or not have engaged with, and they're making some traction. So at least in those 2 examples, but I do acknowledge that that's a small lens on a broad landscape.
Well, we talked a little bit yesterday about some really big examples. I think the question is, what's the next innovation, right? I mean, the low-income housing tax credit, the new markets tax credit. We've seen and work we've done around access to healthy food, about community development, financial institutions, and what you can do in that arena to really solve some market failure and bring in new businesses, new jobs, new access to healthy food, all of that. I mean, that's another $1 billion that's rolled out between philanthropy, business, banks, foundations, et cetera, around the country with the Federal Healthy Food Financing Initiative, but 10 initiatives around the country as well, including in Michigan. So I think, the president's proposed a Promise Zones tax credit. I think there are all sorts of ways we can think about that partnership between the private sector, community, and the public sector, but we've got to figure it. I don't think we have as many places to figure it out, and then we need to build an appetite among politicians to actually make it happen so we can see those new dollars coming in, because there's no question what they can bring, right? They can bring jobs and they can bring economic vitality, and then they can really help to transform children's families and communities. It's huge.
I don't know if Manuel Pastor is in the room, but he and Andrew Glover Blackwell, have often talked about how equity is the best growth policy, and I think many in the business community have come to understand that a lot quicker than some local and state governments have. And so I think that's why you see in all these sort of collective impact partnerships on the ground, not only is business a critical partner, but oftentimes they are driving a good portion of the work because they realize that when communities have been disinvested in over a period of decades and discriminated against, there is a lot of work to do in investing in those places and partnering with those places, but there is also a real business interest in doing so. And we've seen.
Yeah, you may have Standard & Poor's, right?
Right,
And the
exactly.
International Monetary Fund talking about equity investments as the pathway to economic sustainability for communities, regions, and nations. So it is changing the paradigm, and the question is how we change it faster and how we have it take hold in a way that really has the impacts we care about.
Well, can you join me in thanking what I thought was a really terrific round?